So much, Chanel. So my name is Lisa Eastmond Bell, or Lisa Bell. My pronouns are she and her. And today I wanted just to talk about shaping online tutoring practice and really focus on the research and maybe some activities for reflecting on our work rather than thinking about how to replicate what we do in person. So as far as an overview goes, we're going to kind of talk about where we are right now, the benefits of online writing center work, synchronous benefits and myths, asynchronous benefits and myths, why having options matters, some reflection on our values, and then I'm hoping for a really great discussion with all of you who are in attendance this morning. So as I was putting this presentation together, I found myself just wanting to jump right into the research. There's a lot of great stuff happening right now, but I felt it really important to pause for a second. I feel like we haven't done that a lot this year, but pause for a second and think about where we are, and to recognize whether you just moved your whole program online in the wake of a global pandemic, or whether you've been doing it for a couple decades. You're involved in important work. I wanted to acknowledge all the work that has been done this year by those who are very established, sharing their expertise. I've seen so many great resources, training materials, etc., shared online through various organizations, etc., but also to recognize those who are moving entire programs online. Often you aren't recognized for that work. Whole departments have opportunities to have centers for teaching and learning, or OIT departments to help with that transition, and often it is writing center admin and their staff making these moves by themselves. So I wanted to recognize the amazing work that has taken place this year. But I also want us to think about where we are in the process. So if we think about kind of an experiential learning cycle that I think is very applicable to writing center work, we know that we are constantly evolving in our work, trying to refine in our work as part of the learning process. And so we have concrete experiences like moving entire programs online or practicing online tutoring for many years. But ultimately, those concrete experiences should then lead us to kind of step back and reflect and observe what's happening, perhaps learn from the experience and the experience of others, and then maybe refine and reshape what we're doing and move forward in that continual cycle. And it's very similar to the writing cycle, right, that we work with students on. And so pausing to look at your own work is key. And then receiving feedback on your work is also helpful. In the wake of that, maybe you don't have an assessment cycle coming up. Maybe you do, but want a larger picture. I think research steps in as the formal feedback that's taking place within the field that may be useful within that process. So I'm hoping that today we can move from kind of our experience to reflection, and then even maybe conceptualization, and even thinking about where we might move ahead in our practice in online writing center tutoring. And I think it's important to note that reflection and research are key to writing center work as we move it online more than replication. I think there's a tendency to figure out how what we do in person happens online, and that's not necessarily what needs to happen. In fact, again, I think about writing and I think about genres and how some students come to us and they understand what a 5-paragraph essay is, and they want to use that same model for every type of writing they do. And while that can be very foundational and informative for new types of genre, and there needs to be some explicit conversation about transfer of existing skills and knowledge, I would suggest that online tutoring and online writing center work is in many ways its own genre that can be informed by in-person tutoring and writing center work, but is not the same. And I think that you'll find that's the case as we talk about research, and as you may have already found in your practice, and hopefully something we can reflect on today. So I wanted to talk about the benefits of online Writing Center work, tutoring specifically. If we look at the statement put out by the Conference on College Composition and Communication, so C's statement about online writing instruction, Article 13 specifically talks about supplemental instruction, tutoring support, and they talk about how it should be support for those who are learning online. But then if you go into the rationale and read a little bit further, they also address the idea that online tutoring can provide increased accessibility, inclusivity, and equity within the learning experience. And I really want to make sure that those ideas of accessibility, inclusivity, and equity are not side notes or footnotes, but they are very much front and center in this discussion, because they are front and center in the research, maybe even more so than simply supporting folks who are taking online classes. And although I'm citing C's here, know that this is a common thread throughout kind of the interdisciplinary research in this area. So let's talk we've got multiple camps, right? Synchronous and asynchronous. However, with that being said, I also want to acknowledge there's some hybrid approaches we might talk about in the discussion portion, or even as we get to asynchronous. But let's talk about the benefits of synchronous online tutoring. I think it's important to note that it allows participants to establish personal connections. It helps maintain that social aspect and rapport building that many of our tutors especially enjoy in their work, being able to, as part of the learning exchange, really interact with the learner or with the writer. It provides opportunities for real-time conversation, opportunities to negotiate work, to clarify on both the side of the tutor and the writer, to better understand and clarify what's happening. And several researchers have linked that to being really helpful for English language learners to be able to have access to clarify and negotiate and question feedback. And that information, I should note, most of the information that I'm pulling from research is about online writing tutoring, but in some cases, I've also pulled from online writing instruction where teacher or TA feedback has been applicable to the discussion. As far as synchronous online tutoring goes, it also can address issues of time and space. If someone can't physically get into the writing center before close, they may be able to pop online and have a great discussion. I'm also hearing, and we also see in the research, that it helps address issues of how to share a paper, how to work together on a single document. There's no, writer putting their paper down and sliding it over to the tutor, or the tutor craning their neck to be able to watch a laptop. You really can share on screen and even share functions as you're working on a document together. And I think that's an extremely important part of synchronous online tutoring as well. So a few myths that we may want to address is this idea that, asynchronous, it's just a conversation. It's just tutor talk that we moved online. And I would suggest, and the research suggests, that's not the case. Some participants may not have the technology or even the data or bandwidth for some of our synchronous online programming. They may not have stable Wi-Fi. These things can be really important. May not have webcams, may not have access to different features through the technologies that they own. But also they may not be well versed in trying to do multiple things at once online, checking the chat bar, highlighting on the screen or a whiteboard, having a conversation. And so in some ways, it's not as simple of a conversation as we sometimes think it might be. Also, the idea of having this simple conversation is something that often keeps students, even from in-person tutoring, this idea that they have to have a certain threshold of kind of cognitive or affective or even linguistic capital in order to converse in real time. And I know, especially this year, I've had a lot of students who have wanted feedback on their papers in my classes and have actually opted to have an asynchronous approach because they can't have another Zoom meeting. They've kind of maxed out, or they don't feel like they can talk about the subject yet, but they are interested in initial feedback. So these are important things to consider as we think about synchronous tutoring and some of the myths. There has been a preference in the literature, and I think also in practice, as I've kind of been on social media boards and watched threads and such, this idea that synchronous is more akin to quote, real writing center work. And I'm not sure that that's always the case, as we talked about it being kind of its own genre or own form. And Denton, who I noticed is in attendance today, she reminds us that choices about online learning are really shaped to a range of variables, individual contexts, as well as kind of learning preferences and needs. And so synchronous may not be appropriate for all learners all the time. This idea also of being more aligned with writing center work, Boone and Carlson found that as their tutors were preparing asynchronous screen or video cast feedback for writers, they had the time to step back and better align their response with their writing center training and values. And they found it even more aligned to their understanding of writing center work than perhaps a synchronous approach. So these are some of the common myths that I hear, and I think we can go to the research to understand if that is a shared perspective or if there are other parts of the conversation we need to consider. Let's talk really quickly then about the benefits of asynchronous online tutoring. And I think it's important to note that asynchronous is not only email tutoring, but comes in multiple forms, especially in this day and age. But an important thing that it provides is that it allows writers choices about their use of time and space. And so we talked about data bandwidth, but also personal bandwidth, being able to access feedback from a bus, from home, in the margins of your day after children have gone to bed, during a lunch break at work. All of these things can be beneficial use of asynchronous online tutoring. It may be particularly helpful for certain populations, particularly caregivers or working students, as some research has shown. It reduces pressure on tutors and writers to have to respond right away, which has been linked to kind of some mental health issues. And also, again, those kind of thresholds we talked about, whether they're linguistic, cognitive, or affective, those can be important thresholds to be mindful of as we're planning our online programming. One other benefit that I'm finding more and more is that it asynchronous or actually recorded synchronous feedback allows the writer to return to that feedback and review it, maybe more than once. So we know that repetition is key in the learning process. And so having access to that information is an important part of many writers' learning and writing processes. And then finally, asynchronous can also provide a resource-rich online learning environment. It can include things like video, it can include things like links to other websites, similar to what can be done with synchronous. So both really can provide really rich and robust like online learning environments. And I think that's important. Often we think of the actual physical writing center and the resources available there, but I would suggest that the internet makes even more options available to tutors if they know and are trained how to use those. So let's talk a little bit about some myths. The first one I kind of talked about, with this idea that asynchronous tutoring is just email tutoring. And for many people and for many years, that's what it has been. And that is a very viable option that I think writers and tutors can become very comfortable with. Um, but I think we also need to recognize that audiovisual technology also can enhance written feedback. In a recent study, 70% of the writers that I surveyed, along with 2 tutors who helped with the project, we found that 70% preferred the combination of audio, visual, and written feedback. A few preferred just written feedback. Several preferred just video feedback, but the great majority recognized that both forms of feedback really were useful in different ways. Another myth is that asynchronous tutoring means impersonal tutoring. And Anson et al. Found that screencast technologies, which make use of video and audio, actually can facilitate personal connections. Their work was with instructor feedback, and their participants found that it created transparency about the teacher's evaluative process and identity. It revealed their feelings, it provided visual affirmation, and established a conversational tone that really informed the work and the learning exchange there. Another myth is that asynchronous online tutoring is just telling writers what to do. It's just editing. I've even heard the term cheating. And I would suggest that that is not the case. If trained and done well, tutors can actually provide options for writers. And often, if a tutor is not present, a writer will have less, they'll feel empowered, they'll feel less pressure to be led by a tutor and be able to own their own work in important ways. A study that I did kind of based on the work of Makowitz and Thompson, and if you're familiar with their work, they coded 10 in-person sessions and looked at the amount of instruction, scaffolding, and motivation that was happening, what those tutoring strategies and techniques that were taking place. And I did a similar thing with 10 asynchronous screencasts. I guess it's been a couple years now, but I found that many use scaffolding to a really high degree, actually more so than instruction, and that they worked hard to define roles to make sure that the student knew that the tutor was responding as a reader or didn't have the final say. And often tutors would encourage ownership and provide those options, maybe even more so than what I was seeing face to face. But that's also been found in studies by Rees back in 2015. Asynchronous tutoring, another myth might be that asynchronous means there's a lack of dialogue. So I remember thinking that 20 years ago, we are going to miss the heart of our writing center work or tutoring, which is discussion. But I think a lot has happened in the decade or so that's transpired. And we see with social media that a thread and a discussion can last a very long time and can move beyond kind of our initial ideas of time and space to continue dialogue and discussion. Also becoming more familiar with the work of Bakhtin, thinking more about my own work as an instructor and how students make use of feedback. I think the difference is that it's not a tutor-led conversation or dialogue, but that it really is falling more on the shoulders of the writer as learner. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing or something we want to remove, but it's something that we want to be mindful of as we kind of address myths or misunderstandings about different forms of online tutoring. So one thing that I noticed as I've looked at the research over several years is that one suggestion that comes out of many of these studies is that students are offered multiple forms of tutoring. And I'm going to say that in recognition or in conjunction with the idea that I know we're in a time when many people are having budgets cut. They're having to actually scale back on their programming. But I want us to think big picture and consider that offering multiple forms of tutoring can be beneficial. When I say multiple forms, that can mean asynchronous and synchronous, but that also might mean in person or scheduled on person, in person versus drop-in. Same thing for synchronous, scheduled versus drop-in, etc. There are many different forms that our tutoring can take, but when we can offer choices, that can be really beneficial to writers. And several of the studies have shown that that really is the case. We support a diverse range of learners, and they may need a wide range of tutoring options. In the study that I completed recently with two of my tutors, our data collection finished up in the fall, just before the pandemic came on. And so we were looking at 21,934 sessions, the demographic data between in-person, online, scheduled in-person. And then also we surveyed, we had a pool of participants that we surveyed about their experience a little bit more. And we found that survey data showed that 58% of those using our online tutoring services were also participating in in-person tutorials. And that came out very much in the demographic data as well, as we looked at the numbers and saw that return visitors were often returning and having a different form of tutorial. And if we think about that, that might be linked to several things. It could be the stage in the writing or learning process. I think many of us have had the experience where someone comes up to our front desk and says, I just have a quick question about APA. Can someone just answer a 5-minute question? And they don't want to set up a 45-minute appointment. They don't want to sit down for a long amount of time. They want validation, confirmation, or quick information. And so keeping some of those things in mind, others may come in and want a full brainstorming session and take even more time than maybe they're typically allotted. And those different needs, preferences, and contexts can be important as we think about the types of programming we're offering and who's making use of them and when. It also is important in terms of time and space. In the research that I'm kind of, I guess, mentioning here that was done last fall with a few of my tutors, we found, the reason we did that research is we found at looking at over 20,000 sessions that the demographic data for online tutoring participants and in person had some huge differences. And as we surveyed those participating in online services, we found that a lot of it had to do with time and space, and there were a demographic of writers who wouldn't be able to come in and use our in-person services. And this was really the only way they could access our tutoring, whether they were working full-time or they were caregivers or they were language learners, or the space wasn't physically accessible, or there was social anxiety, or they were on study abroad. There were lots and lots and lots of reasons why having an asynchronous online option was useful, in addition to having synchronous in-person possibilities. And then thinking again of those thresholds, and different people at different times of day, at different times in their life, may have different thresholds and need different kinds of learning exchanges with peers and with those who are providing feedback on their work. And I really appreciated this insight from Martinez and Olson. And I'm actually going to read it. I typically don't do that, but I think it's worth really looking at. It says, the principle of providing inclusivity and accessibility grounds all of online writing instruction principles and should be considered at the onset of developing solutions instead of as an afterthought. Accessibility often is considered in terms of disability, and while that certainly is one aspect and one reason that OWLs, or online writing labs, should be thoughtful of access, disabilities are not the only issues that can prevent students from receiving an equitable education. One's socioeconomic status may limit the ability to use synchronous tutoring, for example, in that lack of cameras, microphones, or web conferencing technology, i.e. technology that might otherwise be available in a campus lab, in one's home or public library, may impede certain kinds of access for geographically distributed students. Varying learning styles and levels are other issues to consider when designing online writing instruction materials. For example, some students may learn better with the time flexibility allotted in asynchronous tutoring. To limit tutoring to only synchronous settings would do a great disservice to such students. And I would like to add to that, because obviously there's kind of an angle or leaning towards asynchronous offerings there, that the same could be said if you're only offering asynchronous. That doesn't allow for those who maybe learn best through discussion and dialogue by talking out ideas to be able to follow up in real time, or multilingual writers to negotiate options as far as language use is concerned. Asynchronous may not provide that kind of help in the way that synchronous might allow. And so really it is a balance and a weighing of who we are serving, who benefits from the services we currently offer, who we're seeing and who is not with us, and maybe why. And this echoes back to the work that Lori Salem did in her award-winning article a couple years ago about decisions, who chooses to use the Writing Center. She looked at that with in-person tutoring, and I think she mentions that it provides a really important window when we start thinking about who is not using our services and why that might be the case. And I think that applies to online tutoring just as much as in-person Writing Center work. So as we ask some of those questions, I would suggest that it's worth thinking through what our values are, what our contexts are, at both kind of a local but also larger kind of perspective. And when I say larger, maybe thinking through where we are as a field. What do we know? What do we not know yet? Maybe larger meaning your institution, knowing that there are budget cuts coming, or knowing that you're being asked to maybe adjust your workflow and will need to do the same for your staff or others in the Writing Center. But also thinking through what you value at a local level, what you can do at a local level, and what you hope to provide for those who are part of your learning community in terms of access, inclusivity. And so I feel a little embarrassed sharing this, but 20 years ago as a new Writing Center administrator, I was concerned that the dialectic or discussion-based portion of our work would not continue if we moved it online, especially in an asynchronous way. And I seem to have prioritized that value above others. And I would say, in hindsight and with experience and a better understanding of research and with existing research now, I would suggest that I have different values that would inform and do inform my work. And that would be that Writing Centers ultimately should be supporting learners and learning. When we talk about learning, I love this quote from Mary Dawson from a while ago, where she talks about tutoring is only valid when it's part of the learning process. I think that's really key and at the heart of our work. And also this idea of supporting learners. And I love Nancy Grimm's quote about the work of the Writing Center being a matter of being available mentally and emotionally to engage in the mutual construction of meaning with another. I think that ideas of literacy, writing, right, as well as language and identity are intersected in such inseparable ways that we need to fully consider learners as we think through the services that we provide and how we might provide a more holistic learning experience or exchange not only for the writers walking in our doors, but also for tutors who are learners and for administrators who are also learners. I think that that's a value that I embrace, and something to think about in your own context and locale. So a few questions to consider at this point. I'll read through these, but I think that they might inform our discussion. So I do want to kind of echo a few of them. What online programming is offered? Who is it designed for? Who uses it? Who does not? Do any demographics vary based on the platform that they are making use of? What research is informing your online tutoring or your tutoring in general? How does your assessment, programmatic assessment, maybe inform your programming? What larger values or local values connect or shape your work? How have you addressed issues of access and equity, inclusivity? How do you know you've done it successfully? Whose perspectives or voices have told you that's the case? What are the needs or preferences of writers and tutors, and how can we support both as learners and experts in their own right? Can you offer more than one form of tutoring? Why or why not? What are the limits, and can you move beyond some of those? And what training or outreach might be needed to better prepare both writers and tutors for learning exchanges? And then as a field, maybe a larger field, maybe even in a local way, think about what reflection, research, or maybe revision might be needed in your online Writing Center work. So that's kind of the bones of my information that I wanted to share with you today. I know that in the online version that you're able to download, there are references. That I'm sorry, there are about 3 pages of references, but it might be a good place if you're interested in any of this research, a good place to start moving forward. But at this point, I would love to talk with all of you and learn more about your situations, and also see if we can help each other reflect and rethink the work that we're involved in.
Okay, this is Janelle. We will now engage in discussion and begin wrapping up about 10 minutes before the hour. You can keep posting questions in the chat and we will read them off to Lisa. If you would like to ask a question via audio or sign language, just click the raise hand icon and then wait for the host to indicate your turn. Please begin your turn by giving your name. Next slide, please. To find the raise hand icon, hover over the bottom of the Zoom screen and click the participants icon. This will make the participants panel appear on the right side of your screen, and the raise hand icon is the first icon listed. And now I will turn it over to Elle to facilitate discussion.
Am I okay to stop sharing for a moment?
Of course.
Okay. Sometimes it's easier to talk without the screen there.
This is Elle. So if anyone wants to say their question out loud, as Janelle said, just raise your hand in the Zoom. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and get started and I will read out the questions from the chat. So the first question we had was from Zara, I believe is the name. Just correct me if I mispronounce anyone's name. The question was, should we record synchronous tutoring sessions so that the writer can review the session if needed? And does that imply that the session wasn't effective? And we did already have one answer in the chat to that from Amy that said, our university records synchronous tutoring sessions. Students often want to review their sessions later. I'll open that up for any discussion.
Do you want me to address that first, Elle, or should we, are folks answering in the chat primarily?
They've been answering in the chat just because it was during your presentation, but yeah, I think it would work best if you have answers for them, you go first, and then we'll open it up to everyone.
I would say that that goes back to your local context and the writers that you work with. I think people need to know if they're being recorded, and that is both tutors and writers. It can be really beneficial to be able to access that information at a later time And so I can see how that would be important for learning. But I also understand the anxiety that might cause tutors to know that everything they say is kind of being recorded and might kind of impede their natural conversation. So I think it depends on what your programmatic needs are. And also it sounds like on a practical level, what is already happening on your campus. I know that on my campus, Zoom calls or Zoom meetings are defaulted to be recorded, and that's kind of being accepted as the natural form of things now. But that doesn't mean there can't be informed consent about these issues. I also would say that perhaps, depending on where you store them, making the access only available for a limited time and then deleting any files that are on your end might be something to consider, whether asynchronous or synchronous.
Yeah, I like that idea. I know in my tutoring program right now, we're actually kind of debating that issue of whether or not we want to record the synchronous sessions for students to use later, and kind of what procedure to follow with consent and all of that. So very good question. Does anyone else have any answers to that question or discussion for it? All right, so I don't see anyone, so I will move on to the next question. If anyone anything to say about previous questions, you can always still raise your hand for those. So our next question is from Catherine, and it says, our students want to drop off their papers and have them proofread or fixed. In-person and synchronous sessions, that are there good resources for staff on making asynchronous appointments not that? And Elise has, in addition to Catherine's question, saying of the idea of a screencast response, but many students don't know how to ask for full feedback and just ask for fixing. How have folks dealt with that? So passing it.
Something to consider would be to have an intake form where they prioritize one or two things that they really would like looked at on their paper. I think this is one of those areas where we have to be careful about assigning an in-person context to an online experience. To say that students can't learn with simply written feedback may not be the case. I know that instructors all the time provide written feedback and assume that that's informing a learning experience. And so, but I think helping prioritize can be important. In the research that I've done and the research that I've read, asynchronous actually can be beneficial because tutors are able to think through, organize, and prioritize their responses in ways that may not happen in an in-person session or a synchronous session. And so there are benefits to both, but I don't consider asynchronous akin to dropping off as if that were a way of kind of saying they're not going to participate in the learning process. They may not be present for a tutor-led review of their paper, but we're not sure what they do with that information later. There may be a lot of conversation and learning taking place with the feedback that they're given.
Agreed. This is Sarah, and I'm Associate Director of a Writing Center who operates fully online, and we do primarily asynchronous paper reviews. And so in tutor training, what we've trained our tutors to do is first identify the error, then explain why it's a problem, right? So not, this is broken, but also this is broken and this is how we address it, right? And back to Lisa's point earlier, these are some resources, right, that might help you. So you can always link out in an asynchronous review, which is really handy too. But we only quote, fix it once or twice in the student's paper. And then what we do, and that's through track changes, and then and a comment bubble, then with corresponding color coded and highlighting, we sort of identify where that exists throughout the remainder of the paper. So I do think in training tutors, it's very important to sort of teach them a method where they're encouraging students to have that internal conversation, being able to identify patterns of error, being able to understand why that is a mistake or why they're making this pattern of error, and then empowering them to fix it. So it's not a one-to-one with a synchronous session. It's not a one-to-one with a face-to-face session, but there certainly are models that you can use to make students aware of those same patterns of error without fixing that error throughout their paper.
Good point. And I would second some of the folks that are saying screencasting is a great option. It really does provide that personal aspect, that nonverbal component, the affective side of things that might be important, but it can still be asynchronous.
Okay, Elle again here. Thank you, Lisa and Sarah and Catherine and Elise for the questions. Oh, I see someone with their hand up.
Hi, I just wanted to follow up, Lisa, with what you just said regarding the screencast option. And I did write this question in the chat. So if you are doing audio recording or screencast feedback, how do you then address the equity issues that might be involved? Like, how do you know if your student maybe, you know, either doesn't have the equipment to view it, or, you know, if they're on a phone, or if they do have some kind of auditory issues that prevent them from hearing that feedback? So how do you navigate that?
That's a great question. I think that many students need to be aware of the choices that they have or options that they have. So letting them know that as we review your paper, we'll be making a video where we'll be personalized video where we'll talk about revisions and ideas and feedback. And so that they know that's what they're signing up for. There are all sorts of options for closed captioning, whether it's in screen recording in Zoom or Teams or YouTube. They're not always great, but they are available. And so making sure they know what they are signing up for is important. I would say the same thing happens when students come into this space and our tutors are not trained to work with interpreters, and they're looking at the interpreter, talking to the interpreter rather than the student. There are some different ways that we navigate through training and outreach to have better interactions and to provide more equity.
Thank you.
Okay, Elle here again. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of combine a few of the questions. We have some questions from Marilia, Michael, and Lucia. Basically, they're asking about kind of the actual procedure for asynchronous tutoring, how much time should be allotted for it on the tutor schedule, and how to train tutors to do the asynchronous feedback.
This is Lisa again. I hope that people will share in chat what they do in their context, because I can only speak to the experiences I've had in mine. I worried that we would be inundated by so many asynchronous sessions, we wouldn't be able to get through them. So we made them appointment-based so that tutors were scheduled to review a paper at a certain time. I also found that when tutors were newer to asynchronous, they wanted to address every issue that they saw. We see this in in-person tutoring as well and synchronous tutoring, but we needed to train them to really focus on the items that the writer wanted prioritized or wanted looked at, as well as maybe the assignment sheet, taking that into consideration. And then if they're seeing anything glaring, and then really making some decisions about what to address and when. It might be something where they focus on a couple main ideas and then provide resources to address other concepts later, or invite the person to return, whether in person, synchronous, or asynchronous. But typically when a tutor is new, it depends what form of material they're using. You can go very inexpensive and you can use PowerPoint to record screen casts and put them on YouTube and share them that way, or email them. You can also use Zoom, you can use Screencast-O-Matic, Jane. There's so many different options. So I don't necessarily want to address each platform, but it really depends on what your in-person sessions look like too. Maybe you offer 15-minute sessions and 30-minute sessions, or 30 and 60-minute. Consider doing that in person, or I'm sorry, online as well. Maybe there is a quick asynchronous, quick chat, or quick question that can be addressed versus an actual full paper review. I always told students, or we had in our materials, that we really couldn't look at more than 5 double-spaced pages in a full 45-minute session. And so you'll have to kind of decide what that looks like depending on the writers you're working with. But sorry, it's really contextual, but hopefully that gets you some ideas.
Yes, thank you, Lisa. And I wanted to share that we will be saving the chat files. We'll have access to that afterwards. And I want to say thank you for some great questions from everyone. And I will hand it over to Janelle to wrap up.
Lisa, can you go ahead and share the rest of the PowerPoint, please?
Certainly. Thanks, Janelle.
All right, so thank you to everyone for attending our webinar today, and thank you to Lisa Eastmond Bell for her work in preparing this presentation, and thank you to More Interpreting for being our interpreters today. Next slide, please. Okay, our next webinar is coming up on October 2nd from 4 to 5 p.m. EST. Zandra L. Jordan will present on racial justice and online writing center praxis. You can register for this webinar on our website at onlinewritingcenters.org/webinar. We will also have a survey that we will be distributing to all of you via email. We hope to see you there. Thank you so much for attending today.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to Antonio and Shannon as well.